In this completely remastered tutorial, we're going to learn how to program the classic game Snake in Unity, where you're going to learn to use the new input system along with other programming techniques. I do hope you enjoy this complete tutorial, so let's get started. So we're going to begin by creating our project. So we'll select new project. And we're going to be creating a 2D project. So we'll select the 2D core template. We can then name our project Snake. You can call it whatever you like at this point, but I'm just going to call it Snake. And I'm not going to change the location that I create this project, but you can certainly do that as to where you would like to create that project. And we'll then select create project and let Unity then go off and create our project for us. Now that Unity has opened up our project, I'm going to show you how you can change the layout to suit yourself. If you are familiar with how Unity does this, you can then skip to the next chapter. For those who are going to stick around, I'm going to show that what I prefer to do is try to get the scene to be a bit bigger so that we can see a bit more of what we're trying to do. And I feel that the other windows are just probably a bit too big for what I need, particularly say the console part of it itself. So what I'd like to do is to begin by taking the project window and redocking it to the hierarchy section, and then taking the console window and then docking it to the bottom of the scene window. And then I can drag the console down to where I think I would like to have it. And then I'll just resize the other windows to approximately where I think it would work for me. And you can see then now that I've got a little bit bigger on the scene here. Now you can hit shift space and that'll give you a bit bigger on the scene itself. But if you're developing and you'd like to do this and still see everything, then you can still do what I do here. And lastly, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to select the 3 dots on the project window here, and I'm going to change that to 1 column, and I'm going to turn off the packages. You can then change the workflow to best suit yourself. So what we want to do now is set up our scene. So if we go over to the hierarchy and select the drop down arrow here, we can see our camera. And by selecting the camera, we can now see the properties of this camera on the right-hand side in the inspector over here. So I'm going to change the color, the default color from this blue, so that when we select the game window up here, we can see that this is the color it is by default. But I want to change this to black. So what I'm going to do is by selecting the background color in the inspector, I'm now going to drop that down to a black color, and I'm just going to close that down. I'm just going to go back to the scene, and we can see that with the when the camera is selected, we can actually see down the bottom right hand corner of the scene what the camera actually sees. Now the other thing, what I will explain later on, is we do need to change the size of the camera. But before I go into explaining how that works, let me create a couple of assets. Now, because we have created a 2D project, Unity has installed a couple of extra packages along for us. One of those packages is the addition of 2D sprite shapes. So what that means is now that if I select in the hierarchy with the right mouse button, I can now go down to creating objects of, say, 2D object. I can now select sprites and I can create a square. So it's now created that, and it's asking us, do we wish to change the name? I am going to type in snake head because this is going to be the head of the snake. and I'm now going to hit enter. I'm also going to change the color of this to say maybe a greeny color. Actually, let's make it a yellow. Let's make it a bright yellow, and then close the color window down. And I'm also going to go to the transform of the sprite, and the transform is what holds the position, the rotation, and the scale of the object. And we can see that it's not exactly center. And I'm going to select the dots on the side here, and I'm going to reset that. Now I could have just typed in 0 and 0, but if there's quite a few in there, it's just as easy to hit the 3 dots and hit reset. Now we can see that there's a camera gizmo in our way here. Now some people kind of like that being there because they know where the camera is. I tend to not like it for the 2D side of things because I can see that the camera bounds is there, so I know what the camera is, where it's showing, etc. So I'm going to go to the top right hand side of the scene, and I'm going to select this over here, which is the visibility of the gizmos. And I'm going to scroll down to where it says camera, and I'm going to select the icon and hit that. And that is now switched off, that gizmo. So now that I've created that one, I am going to duplicate this, and I'm going to go Control D, which now duplicates that sprite. Now, I could have just done it the same way that I did the other one, but I wanted to just quickly do it this way. And I'm going to call this one by just selecting it and calling this one Snake Tail. I want it to be the same colors, which is why I duplicated it. But I also wanted the size of the tail to be of a different size. So if I just drag that over to the right-hand side here, for instance, I'm going to show by going over to the transform, I can now change this size to 90% of its original by putting in 0.9 and 0.9. Now, I've put it in all the X, Y, and Z of the scale. In 2D, the Z size scale usually does not matter if it is sprites. If it's a 3D object itself, being displayed in a 2D environment, then you may want to change that. So we can see if we scroll in, that is now 90% of that size. Now, the other thing that I need to do is show you how to create what we call prefabs. Now, a prefab allows us to create a asset from these two game objects that we've created. So as of right now, basically what we've done is we've created 2 sprites in that scene. That means if we wanted to create another scene, then we would have to recreate those sprites. So by creating a prefab or an asset for it as a prefab, we can then use that, and we can use that to instantiate other copies of that at any time that we wish. So to begin, what we need to do is go down to project, and selecting the assets, I'm going to right mouse button on it. I'm going to go and create a folder, and I'm going to call this prefabs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the snake head and drag that into the prefabs. And I'm going to do the same with the tail. And as you can see, they have both turned blue, indicating that they are now prefabs. Now, I'm also going to do another one, and I'm going to do that the same way that I originally created them. And I'm going to go 2D object, sprites, and square. And again, it's asking me to name this, and I'm going to call this food. Oop. And hit enter. Now, again, it has not put it in the center. So again, I'm going to reset its transform. And I'm going to also make this a little bit smaller. So I'm going to say 0.9, 0.9 and 0.9 on the scale. And I'm also going to make this a reddish color, mainly because in Snake, they are apples that the snake is supposed to be eating. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag the food into the prefabs. And once we've done that, we can now go back to and highlight or select these three assets or game objects in the scene, and we can now delete them because we don't want them there. What I'm now going to just double check is to make sure that the transform of these prefabs are all where I want them to be. So by selecting the food, I just want to make sure that the position, rotation, and everything is still what I expect them to be. The snake head, and I know this tail, when I moved it over and it created a prefab, it then created the prefab based on that position that it was sitting in. But I don't want that to be the case. So again, I'm going to reset them. And because I've done the changes on the actual prefab itself, it will automatically make that prefab accept those changes. So what we want to do now is configure the camera. Now, by default, we probably don't need to do anything. And if we were doing a normal non-2D game that wasn't moving in a grid movement, we wouldn't need to do what I'm going to show you here. But because we're going to be moving in a 2D grid environment, I am going to show you a small little tip. But before I get into that, I want to show that if I was to drag the snake head back into the scene, we can see that the middle of the sprite intersects in where the grid crosses, or the grid intersection. So that if we were to move the sprite over 1 unit to the right, we can see that it's going to go into that intersection as well. However, when we look at the camera, we can see that that intersection means that if I was to then go, say, Y5, we can see that if we were to keep it in whole units, which is what we want to do, then the sprite or the snake, if we go to the game view, is actually going to be half off the screen. So again, because we do want to do this in whole units, I'm going to offset the camera by 0.5. So what that means is you can see that the sprite is now up against the edge of the screen, and we can verify that by going into the game view and seeing that it's at the top of the screen. So that's the first small little tip that we're going to change. Now, the other thing is that the play area of this isn't that big. Now, by default, you can see that while the camera is still selected, in the inspector here, we can see that it's got a size of 5. So what that means is that we put the camera back to 0 so that it's not offset, we can actually see that from the grid here that there's 5 at the top and 5 at the bottom. So basically from the middle to the top and the middle to the bottom, there is 5 squares, or what we call 5 units. We actually don't want 5, well, that's 10 units in size, but we actually want more than that. We actually want 4 times that. Now you can make this any size you want, but I'm going to make it a size of 40. So the screen size is going to be 40. So I'm going to select the size in the camera, and I'm going to change that to 20. And I'm now going to scroll this in so that I can now see the camera. And you can do that by just using the scroll wheel on the mouse itself. And I'm going back to the game view. we can now see that it's a smaller sprite in our screen. So that means you can double check it by going in and scrolling in, and you can count the number of units that are there, but rest assured there is 40 units there. I'm now going to select the camera's Y position, and I'm going to re-offset that to 5. Okay, so I'm now going to create one more asset, which I didn't do before, but I kept this one separate because I wanted to get this out of the way first. So by doing the same thing, by creating a 2D sprite and a square, I'm going to call this a wall. Now I can do this a number of ways. I'm going to first reset the transform of that again, and I'm going to give it a color of, say, a bluish color. And I'm going to show you one way we could do this. We could leave, whoops, I'm trying to grab that and drag it up, not the size of it. I could leave it so that it's one square, and which I am going to do. And I'm actually going to show you how to programmatically create this. But if you don't want to do it programmatically, you could just select the sprite and then size it by its handles by going into here, and you'll see that the mouse will change to 2 arrows going in that direction. And that means you can now size it out to whatever size you want. And then you can create this wall along here if you wanted to. But like I said, I'm going to show you how to do this programmatically. Okay, so I've now just undone all of that. Go back to the created sprite for the wall. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the others. I'm going to drag that into the prefabs folder and make a prefab from it. And I'm now going to remove those two from the scene. Just going to save it again. It doesn't hurt to save often, because you just never know when you just may lose that work. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a script. So before we create the script, the script also needs to be attached to a game object in the scene. So we first need to create a object, and we're going to call this board. And if you didn't see, I created an empty object so that all it's going to have is a transform. And I'm going to again have that reset to 0. And I'm now going to go down into my project, and I'm going to select on the scripts. I'm going to right mouse button on that, and I'm going to select a C# script. And I'm going to call this board manager. You don't have to call this board manager, but because it's creating the board, I've just created a board manager. Board is just fine. You can name this whatever you want, just as long as you know what it's doing. So by hitting enter, I'm now going to go back to the board. I'm going to drag the script that I've just created. Now I can do one of two things. I can drag it onto the object into the hierarchy itself, or I can drag it into the inspector. And as long as I get that blue bar there, it's going to drop it onto that object. Now I can either double click in the script from here, or I can double click the script down here. And once I've done that, the script will then open up. By default, we get a basic template. Now, I prefer to remove all this. Sometimes you don't need the update, and sometimes you don't need the start. And then there are times where you may not need either. So it's always good just to remove it and start from scratch. Now, if we go back to the game, what we want to do now is we want to create a couple of variables. Now, the variables are going to be set up so that I can configure this board script to generate the the walls based on where I want it to and the size that I want them to. So what I need to do now is create some variables, and I'm going to make them private because I do not want them to be accessed anywhere else, but I do want them to be accessible from the inspector. So to have them editable from the inspector, what we need to do is create a serialized field, private, and the type of variable that we want. And in this case, I want a game object. And by default, everything is a game object within Unity. And I'm going to call this a wall prefab, if I can spell. And I'm going to do two more. I'm going to do another serialized field, again, private. And this is going to be a game object as well. And this one is going to be the snake's head, because we are going to instantiate that rather than have it in the scene as well. We want one more. Well, actually, we want a couple more, or a few more. So the next one, again, another serialized field. I'm going to call this one private. But this time, I'm going to create a vector 2. And I'm going to call this the starting corner. And I'll explain that in a minute. So if we now go back to Unity, and we can now see that the variables have now appeared in the inspector. I'm going to drag the wall prefab into the wall prefab, and I'm going to drag the snake's head into the snake area here. Now, the starting corner is going to be set up somewhere up here somewhere. So basically, you can decide where you want that to be. For now, I'm not going to make this change. I'm just going to, well, actually, no, I will make that change, because I'm going to say, because we might change it later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, okay, if this is 0 here, and that's the y-axis, I'm going to go, well, this has got to be -10, -20, and then -30. Right, so if I scroll in, I can go, so -30, and I want it to sort of be about here, okay, or maybe here. So that's -30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, yeah, -37. So if I select back on the board again, I can say that the X is going to be -37, and the Y is going to be 10, 20. So I can put 20 there. Now, for now, I'm just going to quickly save that, and I'm going to go back to the script. So once we're back in the script, I'm going to put in some other variables, and I'm going to create a couple more serialized fields. Now, these serialized fields are going to basically be how wide and how high the walls will be. So by selecting private, and this one's going to be a int, and that's going to be the width. And I'm going to say default that to 50. And this is where I'll explain the overriding that in the inspector. We may not override this, but I will explain it. So the serialized field, one more time, with another private int, and this time it's going to be the height of, say, 40. And I'm going to create one more variable, and this is going to be the position that we will calculate of where we want to, I don't have to do it in this, in up here, but I will globally put it up here. And this is going to be another vector 2. I'm going to call this pos, as in position, abbreviated. And we're going to set that to vector to 0. That just basically says that the XY is always going to be set to 0 on initialization. So now if we go back to Unity, we can see that we've now got those in here as well, and we can actually change these values. So if I change that to say 45, then this is now going to be serialized as 45. So if I go back to the script, it won't matter what is said here now. The inspector is now going to override those values. Now that we've done that, what we're going to do now is we're going to create an awake event, and I'm going to create a method, but to create that method, I'm going to call that method first, and I'm going to call this generate walls. And the editor is telling me that there is an error there. So I can either ignore it and then go off and create my method, or I can go into here and say, generate that for me. And I'm going to just do that now. This will then create the method for us, and we can then just remove the throw. And what we can do now is start to create our wall. Now I'm going to create 2 loops, and the 2 loops are going to be for creating the bottom and the top walls and the left and the right walls. So we're going to start with the side walls. Creating a for loop of type integer, and I'm just going to say I. It doesn't need to be anything spectacular as long as you know what that variable is. And I'm going to set it to 0. And then I'm going to go and say, if I is less than the height, then we're going to increment the variable, and that'll only get incremented once it's run the body. And when we create these 2 curly braces, that is now telling us that this is the body of what we're going to tell that for loop to do. So what we want to do is we want to say vector 2, not 3, pos equals new. And this is what we're going to create a new vector 2, because we're telling it that that's what we want. And what we're going to do is we're going to say starting corner dot x comma starting corner dot y, and we're going to say -1, because actually you'll see in a minute. If I actually, let me just remove that, and then we'll explain that bit. And then we're going to create another function, but before I do that, I'm going to say display wall. Now, the reason I'm doing this, I'm going to pass in the pos. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to be duplicating some code here. So because I'm going to be duplicating some code, it is easier to create that as another method. And again, I'm just going to say generate that method. Once that's now created, I can now go into there, removing the exception that it will throw. And I'm going to do the same thing as I was going to do before. I'm going to create a game object with Go, and I'm going to instantiate that wall prefab. And as you can see, the IDE is filling some of that in. Is this what you want to do? And most of that is going to be yes. And then once I've instantiated, I'm going to say go.transform, and I'm going to set the position to what we passed in. And if I hit the equal sign, so because we've created it out here and I'm passing it into this method, we're getting this variable pos, and we're going to set it to that position. So once we've done that, what we're going to do now is we're going to set the parent to the current object. So if you remember, we created the script on the game board object. So by doing this, by going go.transform and parent, and we're just going to say transform. So basically what it's saying is the object that we've just created, we're going to set the parent of that child to the current transform. What that is if I just save that script and we'll go back to Unity. So inside Unity, if I select the board, and what happens is if this script then runs, it's going to create or instantiate those objects, but it's going to create them inside the board here. So if I hit play and there's no errors, well, it didn't do what I thought it would do. But we can see that it has created all of them, but it seems to have created them all in the same spot. Okay. So that means that there is something wrong. As you can see, we've got them all in the same spot. So we can go back to the script and let's have a look at what we did wrong. So what we can see is that because we're doing it on the Y, because we're doing it on the height, when we're creating the Y, we're basically saying that the Y is always going to be in that spot, hence why it was always creating in that spot. So what we want to do is we want to say minus I. So if we now go back to Unity and we now run this, we can now see that it's generated a wall down the side of our screen. Now comes the interesting part. If we go back to the script, we now want to duplicate this same script over. So if I just copy that, just so that I don't have to retype it all, and just paste that in here, I don't really need to tell it what type it is because I'm going to be using the same variable as up here. But this time I'm going to say do the starting corner dot x plus the width. So that means that instead of doing it on the left-hand side where it was, it's now going to add on the X to where we're telling the width of it is going to be. So by default, it's 50. That means that if it's set to 0, for instance, it's going to then go over and start creating them on plus the 50. And again, we're going to, because we're doing it down on the Y, we do want that on the same calculation. And again, we're going to be calling the display of the wall. Going back to Unity, if we scroll out and select the board, we can say that the width is 45 here, but I'm going to just put that back to 50 because that's what we did want it, and press play. We can now see that it's now where we want it to be. However, I'm feeling that that's probably not enough. So I'm going to make that 60 and just check to see if that's good enough. Yep, 60 seems to be okay. Now, the reason I don't want it right over the side here is because we're going to put some information in here and we're going to start by putting a score here. Now, you could put anything you want down here, but I'm just going to start with a score. You could put down, you know, whether the players has collected X amount of food types or whatever. That'll be up to you. And the same as you can display this any way you want, but I'm just going to show you roughly how to do what we're doing. So now that we've done the two side walls, what we're going to do now is do the bottom and the top. So we're going to do exactly the same thing in sense that we're going to create another for loop, and we're just going to do for int I. We're just going to do exactly the same, and this time it's going to be on the width. And again, I'm just going to copy. And because it's very similar, I'm just going to copy and paste this. And I'm going to do that twice. Now, again, I'm going to remove the declaration of the type. And I'm going to change the first vector creation here. This time what we want to do is we want to do a plus I. Okay. And when we do the Y, we want the first one to obviously be what the Y should be. So that should, if we've done that correctly, create the wall across the top of the screen. Now, we do the same thing with the second vector creation, only this time on the X, sorry, not on the X, we do the same thing on the X, but this time on the Y, we're going to do something a little bit different. Because of the way it works, we're actually going to say minus, and we're going to create a bracket, and we're going to say height minus 1. Now, the reason for that is so that it does not show off the screen if we don't do the -1. If we've done that right, and we go back to Unity, if we press play now, it should look correct, and it does. That is how you can then create that programmatically. You don't have to do it that way, but it's just a good way of learning a little bit about scripting. Going back to the script. So the next thing we want to do now is we want to create the player. So we can say create player. Actually, I'm going to call this instantiate player. Actually, let's do this correctly, because normally I would say player, but this is Snakehead. So this time let's create the Snakehead. And again, if I do this, it should put it at the top. Yes, it did. So game object. Now I could call this Snakehead if I wanted to. If I type it properly. And instantiate. Normally when you do this, you would also pass in whether you want where you want it to instantiate, the position, and whether you want it parented or not, and the orientation and stuff like that. In this particular case, we're not going to worry about that. I am going to set the position of the snake, and I'm going to do that again by creating a pos. All we need to do is that we are going to create a vector 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to say starting X, and then we're going to say plus brackets, and we're going to close it off and put underscore width in there, and then we're going to divide that by 2. So that's going to give us the center of it in the X direction. So if, for instance, the width of the player is 60, then it's going to be on the X is going to be on 30. And we're pretty much going to do the same thing for the Y direction. And as you can see, my IDE is telling me that, well, you obviously think that that's what you want to do, so I'm going to suggest it. So of course that is exactly what I'm going to do. And again, it's going to say divided by 2, which is what I'm going to do. And then we're just going to say snakehead dot position, if I hit the correct key, dot position, oops, transform, because it's a game object, so we need transform dot position and equals to dot pos. And if we go back to Unity, when we hit play this time, it didn't work. This is a case of, well, okay, why did that not work? So if we go back to the scene and we can select the here, we can see, well, okay, interesting that it's put the player up here. So it shouldn't have put the player up there. It should have been putting it down in here. So where did we go wrong? So if we go back to the script, let's have a look at what went wrong. Okay, so what we can see is that when the IDE suggested something to us, it's a thought that we might want to do it, add it to the starting Y. In actual fact, what we wanted to do was subtract it. So we can save that, go back to Unity, and this time when we hit play, it should be right in the center of the screen. Okay, so we're now going to do the input of the player or the snake. but we're going to use the input system, and we need to install that and set up the mapping. So we'll begin by installing the package. We'll go to the package manager. We'll go to the registry, and we'll scroll down until we see the input manager, or the input system, sorry. And we'll then select install, and Unity will then go off and do what it needs to do. When you get this, just say yes, and it will go off and reload the project. Now that it has reloaded, we can close this down, and we're going to create a new folder down here. Now I like to do this just to keep it separate and collected. I'm going to call this input system. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right mouse button on that and then go to create, and then right down the bottom we'll see the input actions, and we're going to then select the input actions, and I'm going to call this player controls so that we know that it's going to be containing all the player controls. And I'm going to then double click on that to open it, and I'll open this little window which I'm going to dock up the top next to the game window. I'm now going to create an action map, and I'm going to call this player. And I'm just going to go over to this new action, and I'm going to rename this movement. And I'm going to then select on the side here where it says the action type. I'm going to change that to value, and I'm going to change this to a vector 2, so that when we push up or down or whatever, it's going to give us a X and a Y value based on what it actually is. So I'm going to delete what it's got here, and I'm just going to go back to the movement, and I'm going to select the plus, and I'm going to add an up, down, left and right composite. And I'm going to call this WASD, so that it represents our keyboard for W, A, S, and D. I'm going to also create two more. Actually, no, I'll create one more. What I'll do is I'll just create one for the gamepad. Actually, no, I won't do the gamepad. And I'll do one more for arrow keys. And we'll do the... go to the WASD one, and we're going to click on the first one, which is up. And what we're going to do now is we're going to bind these composites to a key itself, so that when we press that key, the system knows that we're telling it to do an up. So once we've had that selected, we can go to the path, and we need to select the keyboard with the arrow. Now, in this particular version, there is an issue with how sensitive the click and buttons are. It never was this bad, so if they fix it and you're watching it on a fixed version, just be aware that I'm having that particular issue. So I'm going to select the keyboard, and when you see the mouse hover like change like that, then it knows that I know that it's now done. Now, the other thing too is I cannot see where it says listen anymore, so I'm going to try and guess where it is. Because what we're going to do is we're going to listen out for the key to change it or bind it to. In that case, I hit the right spot, and I'm going to hit W for up, and W will then select, and I just select that to do that. And I'll do the same for down. And I'll just quickly fast forward all this so that you don't see it. Now that we've done the WASD keys, we're going to do exactly the same thing for the arrow keys. And again, I'll fast forward through there so you speed it up. Now that we've done that, what we can do now is save this. But we'll just make sure that these are set to digitalized or digital normalized, and that these are correct. And yes, they are. So what we do now is we've got to make sure that the asset gets saved for us, so and generates a class. So on the right-hand side in the inspector here, we're going to tell it to generate a C# class file for us, and it's going to tell us where it thinks it should put it, and we're just going to accept that suggestion. If you want to change this, you just hit the arrow, the 3 dots over here, and you can just change where you want them. But I'm just going to accept that. And it'll just do what it needs to do. And unfortunately, you can't do a Control S to save. You need to select the save asset in the toolbar up here. Now that we've created those mappings, we can actually close that down. And what we're going to do is now create a script. And it's going to be a C# script. And we're just going to call this player controller. You can call it or snake movement, or actually let's call it snake movement or mover. And we're going to double click that now to open that up. Once it's opened, you will find that it will give us a default template. I'm just going to select everything and delete them. I'll tend to like to start from scratch so that I know what I'm doing, sort of thing. So there's a couple of things that we can do here. Actually, let me go back to the editor for a minute. One thing I could have explained is that with the player, I don't know where that came from. Let's go for the snakehead and click on snakehead. Now, when we create a script, actually, let me put that onto there while I think about it. So what I've done now is that I've dragged the snake mover and I've put it onto the head so that we can now control the direction that the head is going in. So I'm going to go back to the script, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private variable, and I'm going to call this player, did I call it player controls? And I'm just going to call this underscore controls. And then I'm going to create an awake method so that when the system starts up, so I'm just going to go controls, and then I'm going to instantiate those player controls. So when the snake is instantiated on the screen, we're then going to create a copy of those controls. And because it's not a mono behavior, we can actually do it like we create an instance of another class. Now, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to create 2 more events, and one of them is going to be the onEnable event, and the other one is going to be the onDisable event. Now, in the onEnable, I'm going to go underscore controls dot player. Remember, we called the mapping player. And then we're just going to say enable. Yes, so we're just going to call the enable so that it now gets enabled. And inside the disable, we're going to do a very similar thing. We're going to go controls dot player dot disable. So that means that it's going to, anytime that this component is added or removed or enabled or disabled, it's going to set our controls up. What we need to do now is we need to create a subscription to how to handle the movement script. So if we go underscore control dot player, and if we start typing movement, we can see that it's going to suggest movement, and that's what we want. And the next one, if we hit the period key again, we're going to see a few selections here. One that we're not going to see is performed, cancelled, and started. In this case here, all we're going to be worried about is performed. What we need to do then is actually subscribe. So to do that, we do plus and equals. So that means that anything that's already set up for it, we can just add that to it. And we're just going to call movement. It's telling us that we have not created that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hover over it, select the light bulb, drop it down, and we're going to select generate method movement. And of course it puts it in the wrong spot for us. So I'm just going to move that down. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and just arrow down till it goes to where I want it, and remove the exception, the throwing of the exception. Now, if we've set the player context up correctly, what we can do is we can say vector2, because we told it that we wanted a vector2, and I'm going to call this direction. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the context which has been passed in to this method, this callback. That's going to have a few things for us. And one of them will be the read on the value of a vector2. So that then gives us what we do, what we hit. So if we then do a debug log here, we can then output that direction just so that we can see what's going on. And I'm going to go back to Unity. So when we hit play, you might see that nothing has happened or is happening. But if I hit the W key, we can now see that it's now giving us a vector of X and Y. So W is 1 up, S is -1 down. So that's working as expected. So I'm just going to play that, and I'm going to go back to the script. So now in the script, what we want to do is we now want to do we want to hold that direction because the player will be I say player, but I mean snake. The snake will continually keep moving in that direction. So what we want to do is we want to hold a private vector, and this is going to hold our current direction. And I'm going to call it current direction and set it to vector2 of 0. So it means that it's not moving at all. Okay. Now I'm going to remove the debug log. The other thing is with Snake is that if you're already moving in a direction, you don't want to travel back on yourself. If you do, then it will be game over. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the current direction, or we'll just say if direction, which is what we're reading from, is equal to the current direction, then we're just going to return out of the method. We're not going to do anything else. So when we get to actually moving the player, you actually don't need these braces there. But if you want to leave them there, that's fine. And what we want to do now is we want to say current direction is equal to direction. And we're going to create another variable. And we're going to make this one a Boolean. Now, the reason we're doing this as a Boolean, as a true and false, what we're going to do is say, are we moving? When you don't define something, I could actually sit here and say equals false if I wanted to. But by default, a Boolean will always default to false. Now, when I say is moving, I'm going to also put in the movement side method here. I'm going to set is moving to true. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because we are going to put a timer in. Okay, so what we're going to do something here. We're going to say and is moving, and we're going to exit out. Now, what we also need to do is we need to now add a float for our timer. So again, this is going to be another private variable, and we're going to call this underscore movement timer. Actually, I'll call this move timer, and we're going to initialize that to 0. And we're also going to create another one. And again, this is going to be a float, and we're going to call this movement speed. And I think we'll set that to 3F. Actually, we might set that to 0.3f. And they are the two current variables that we need for our timer. And we're now going to create an update loop. And inside the update loop, what we're going to do is we're going to actually, what we'll do is we'll set up a position first. And we'll set this to 0, which will then add to the direction 2. But for now, we'll just do that. And what we'll do now is we'll say underscore move timer. And we're going to add the time.delta time. So every frame, we're going to add delta time to that variable. And then we're going to compare the timer and see if it's greater than or equal to the movement speed. Now the movement speed is going to change so that every time you eat a food, the speed will actually start getting faster and faster and faster. The way I've set this up at the moment, it just gradually gets faster. Sorry, the way I'm going to set this up is just going to slowly get faster and faster. We need to now get a cache of the previous position, and we're just going to get that from the transform. And now we're going to add the position with the, if I can type again, the current direction. So that means that if we change our direction and we set that current direction, we're now going to add that to the position. And the last thing we need to do on the outside of this is to do a transform.translate. We don't need to do a translate. We could actually do transform.position equals position. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do translate position instead, and now save that and go back to Unity. And actually, there's one more thing. The current direction, I think I set that to 0. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually set that to right. And the reason I'm setting that to going direct to right is because when the game starts, the snake will start going right from the very beginning. So now we'll go back to Unity. Now, if we've set this up correctly, when we hit play, we should start to see the snake going to the right. And if we then hit the WASD keys or the arrow keys on the keyboard, the snake should change direction, provided we're not already going in that direction. And of course, it moved, but it was way too fast. Now, the reason it was way too fast is to reset the move timer. So basically, if this condition is true that we've hit the movement speed, we also need to reset it back again. So hopefully if we go back to Unity now and press play, it should now move a lot slower. So I'm going to click the board again, and there you can see it's now moving a little bit slower. And if I press up, it's going to go up. If I go left, it's going to go left. Now, if I press left again, well, it's not going to say anything because it's already going left. Actually, what we've got wrong here is, actually, I've got that wrong. You'll notice that what I should have done is we should be going in the opposite direction. Okay. So basically what I'm saying is if I'm already going left, I should not be able to go right. That's what I need to do. So if we go back to the script, so what we need to do now is to say, instead of doing if it's equal to the current direction, we're going to use something called the dot product. Now, the dot product is going to take two vectors and it's going to see whether it's the opposite. So to do that, we'll type in the vector2 and the dot, and we're going to create the direction as one and the current as the second argument. Now, when it is in the opposite, it will be equal to -1. So if it's equal to -1 and is moving, then obviously we don't want it to change direction. Now, this causes a problem because I set the is moving to false, but I changed it to automatically move in the right direction. So we will change this to true to say that it is already moving. and we now check for the player moving, it should now work properly. So we'll go back to the editor. We will now press play, and we can see that it's now moving left, down, right, and up. So now if I press down, it should not change direction, and it doesn't. Same as I'm going left. If I try to change it right, it won't work. So that's all working properly. Now that we've done that, what we'll do now is we're now going to create another script. But before we do that, I'm going to create another empty object inside our hierarchy. And I'm just going to call this managers. It's also going to hold something else other than just the managers, but it's going to hold, well, it's going to hold a few things, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, I'm going to make sure that I reset its transform back to zeros. I'm going to go down to the scripts, and I'm going to create another script, and I'm going to call this game manager, and this is going to end up managing our game. We'll open that up, and again, we'll just move everything out of there, and we'll start from fresh. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a list. I prefer to use lists over an array for things like this. But the reason that we're going to do this particular one is because we're going to create a reference to all the objects that are on the screen, apart from the walls themselves. So what we're going to do is we'll just call this private list, and we're going to hold the transforms. We don't need anything else. It's capital T, transform. And the reason we're holding the transforms, because what we want to do is when we spawn in a piece of food, we don't want that food popping onto the snake itself. So I'm going to actually call this screen objects. You can name this anything you really want. Screen objects is just as good. While we're in here, I'm also going to set up the game states. So basically what this means is that if we're still in play, whether we're in a menu, all that sort of stuff, but there are certain things we don't want to continue running. So we're going to call this a game state. And for now, we're just going to put in play game. Let's make that game in progress. Game 1, game over. Well, technically, in this particular scenario, there won't ever be a game 1. We could make it so that if we get to a point where the last available spot is a piece of food, and you can eat that food, well, then obviously it could be a game 1 situation. So I might just leave it in there. That's pretty much all we need for now, but you could add other things like you're into the intro, you're into a main menu, all that sort of stuff, so that certain things are not running when you're in those things. Now, the thing too is I'm going to go back to the snake, and inside the update, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the game state, the game manager, actually, before I do that, there's another thing I need to do. In the awake, actually, before I do the awake, what we're going to do is we're going to create a private game manager, and we're just going to call this game manager. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go looking for that game manager. But the way we're going to do it is we're going to say game manager, game object, find object of type, and we're going to do game manager. Now, because I've misspelled the class up here, what I can do is I can select there, and I can press F2 on my keyboard. And now it might be different. Actually, I'll show you the other way of doing this, because it might be different for you guys. If I clicked in here and right mouse button on here, I can go to rename, and you can see that it's F2 for me. It might be Control Alt R or something, or Control Shift R or something for you guys. But what we want to do is we want to rename this. Now, when we do this, it's also going to refactor every instance of that for us. So I'm going to change that to game manager, and this is not only going to change the class name, it's going to rename the file for us as well. So now that I've done that, I can go back into here and type in the correct values. Now you'll also notice that I did remove the game object and just put find object of type. So that means that when this now starts up, provided that the game manager is attached to that scene, we're now going to get this correct in here. So now that we've done that, I can now go back to my update, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see, actually there is one thing I did forget. I'm going to go back to the game manager, and I'm going to also create a public. Actually, let me stick it up here with public. I like to keep them all together. So I'm going to basically call this game state, and it's going to hold the game state. I'm going to call game state. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to do this differently. What I am going to do is I'm going to create a private, I don't know what happened there, private game state. And I'm going to make sure that this is game state. And I'm going to default this to game in progress. Now, you wouldn't normally do it this way by setting it to the in progress, because you would change the state later when you actually are in the gameplay. So if you're creating a menu system, you might want to default it to the menu, but because we've only got these 3 states, I'm going to default it to the in progress. Now, because I've done that, I also need to do a switch game state. Or a setting of the game state. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a public, and it's going to be not returning anything. And this is just going to say set the game state, and we're going to pass in that game state, or a game state, I should say. And what we're going to do is do a game state is equal to the game state. So that will now switch that, but we can't get that just yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a public game state, and we're going to actually do a property here. So what we'll do is we're going to say, let's call this current state, and I'm going to basically do a get on that, and I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to click the rename, and I'm also going to change this to current state as well. So as you can see, it's now changing all the other instances of that in there as well. And I'm going to now hit enter. All right, current state's better, because otherwise if I kept it as game state, it's going to conflict with our enum up there. So what we need to do now is we need to do a switch here, and we're going to do this on the game state that was passed in, so that if it is doing some stuff, then we're going to say, if we go to the, say, hit the tail, or we've hit a wall, what we want to do is say case game state well, let's say it's in progress. Actually, that reminds me, I will need to change something else too. So we're going to say if it's in progress, and then we're just going to do a break on that, and we're just going to do a default break as well. So what we're going to do here is, if we're doing, let's say, a score, which I will do this, I won't, because we will be doing this later. I may as well put it in now. So we're going to do private int. No, I'm going to make that public, I think. Yeah, I will make that public, and we'll just call that score. Now, because I can set it to 0 here, but I'm not going, well, I will, but I'm also going to make an awake method. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we set the game state to game state in progress there. So rather than do it here, we're going to make sure that it's set when it starts up. So that means that when we get to the switch statement down here, we can now add score equals 0. Okay, done. And we can also do something similar with the game over. Now, because I'm not going to go as far as the game 1, what happened there? Case. I'm just going to type in game state dot game over and just type in break. So what we can do here is eventually we can add in, say, did we have a high score and all that sort of stuff. So we can say, all right, so basically we've set the game state to game over, and then we can say, did the current score meet the high score? But we're not going to do that just here, but we will add that at, say, another point in time. So we're going to go back to our snake, and what we're going to do now is we're going to say if the game manager current state is equal to the game state, game manager dot game state, and that is game in not game in progress. Yes. So basically, if we're not in progress, we're basically going to say return. And that just basically means that this is all not going to work. Now, I don't have to do it, but I'm also going to copy that line of code. And it just means that, no, actually, I won't do it. I'll show another way later. So let's now create a scripted crew spawn in our food. It's just going to be a very simple one. So let's go to our editor. And what we're going to do is the same thing. We're going to click on the scripts and we're going to create a script. And we'll just call that food spawn. No. And we're just going to wait for that to do what it's doing. And we're going to double click that and bring that in. Same thing, remove all of the junk there. And the first thing what we're going to do is we're going to create a serialized field. And this one is going to be our prefab for the food itself. So we'll keep this as a game object. And let's call this underscore food prefab. Oops, food prefab. Now, the other thing what we're going to do is we're going to create a start method, and we're going to do something a little bit different than what we would normally do. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use something called invoke repeating. So we'll create the invokes repeating. Now, I don't like using strings here, but for now, I'm just going to very quickly show you that I'm going to create the spawn, and then we've got two more parameters that we can pass in. And the first one is how long it's going to be before it does the first one. So we're going to call this, say, 3 seconds, or yeah, 3 seconds, I think it is, which is the time. And then the second one's going to be the repeat rate, and we're going to do the same thing. And I will actually make these both floats. We can change that later if we absolutely need to. So once it's now done, because I said before we need to do this correctly, so what we actually need to do is when this is being destroyed, so if I go on destroy, I need to do cancel invoke. So that means that the invoke repeating will get cancelled. So what we're going to do now is we will create the spawn, and it's not going to return anything, so we'll just call it spawn. And because nothing's getting passed in, we'll just create it normally. And we're going to do the same thing as we did in our snake mover. We are going to create an awake. Oh, before we create the awake, we actually do need to create a private game manager. And we also need to now set it up so that the game manager equal to find object of type game manager. So in the spawn, we're also going to do the same thing here, so that if the state changes, we're going to do a cancel in here as well. So what we need to do is make sure that the game manager current state is not equal to the game manager game state game in progress. And what we'll do is we'll put in our block quotes, and what we're going to do is we're going to do cancel invoke and return. So basically that's just going to cancel the invoke so that it will stop spawning the food. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create two variables, and both of them are going to be X and Y. And we're going to do a while loop here. Now, I want you to be very careful with while loops, because if you don't have a way to get out of these, it can lock up your project. And I highly suggest that you always save your script, go back to your editor, save your project, because if something does go wrong and you haven't saved your project, you will lose work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say x is equal to int. Sorry, when I say int, I'm going to actually cast this back as an int. So we're going to say random.range, and we're going to create, actually, we're going to create a couple of variables as well. This will come evident a little bit later. So I'm going to put in serialized field, private ints. I'm going to call one border left. I'm going to set that to default 0, and I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste that 3 more times, and I'm going to say right, top, and bottom. So I'm going to do the random range, and the first one I'm going to do is the border on the left. So border left, and I'm going to add 1 to that. Actually, I won't add 1 to that. We can adjust that later if we actually need to. And then I'm going to do border right. So that'll be the X, and I'm going to do the same thing for the Y. I'm going to cast it back to an integer, and we can see that it's already told me that I might want to do top and bottom, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. So once I've done that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a comparison. Actually, what I'm going to do first, so I'm going to go back to our game manager. Now, in our game manager, you will remember I did this screen objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a method here that's going to say, actually, I'm going to add 2, and one of them is going to be, they're both going to be public. First one is not going to return anything, and it's going to say add screen object. And I'm going to pass it in the transform. And the other one I'm going to create is going to be public, and this one's going to be true or false. So we're going to return a Boolean this time. We're going to say find screen object, and we're going to then pass in a float, position X on my float, position Y. Now that's going to become evident in a minute, but it does need to be a float. The main reason it needs to be a float is because the vectors are, when the X and Y's on them are floats. So basically, I'm going to then say transform, and I'm going to say the object transform. So what we're going to do is we're going to now say if that list of screen objects. So in the screen objects, we're now going to say where. Now this is going to be a LINQ expression. So that means that if you don't have your ID quite set up correctly, if you didn't notice, we've now created a using system.linQ up here. Now, this is a very small game, so the FPS is not that worrisome for me. So, this is something that you would typically not do every update. So just keep that in mind, because it can create performance issues because of how long it takes to run, as well as it also creates garbage. But because it's a very small game, the garbage and the FPS is not going to be worrisome to us here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an expression. We're going to say x, and then x.position, and we're going to say .x is equal to posx, and we're going to say x.position.y is equal to posy, and as you can see, it's kind of filling it out for us. So basically, if your IDE doesn't do this, then we're basically saying, is the position of the object that we're finding equal to the position X that we're passing in? And is it also equal to the position Y? Then I only want the very first one that you find, or default. Now, if it can't find anything, then it's going to return null. Okay? That's important, because if you don't do first or default, then it will throw an exception error. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say if object transform, then we're going to say return true, because we did find something, and we're just going to say, well, we don't actually need to do the else statement. We can just do return false. So we can go back. Oh, actually, before I go, let me create the add screen object while we are here. Actually, there is actually one more while I think about it. We also need to do a public void remove screen object. What happened there? And this time I'm going to use the transform, And I'm just going to go back to the add screen object first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go add screen object, and we're going to pass in the transform. So that means that when we pass in the transform, we're going to add that to the list. And for the removal, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to say screen objects dot remove transform. That may not make sense to you right now, but later on it actually will. So if we go back to our food spawner, and now that we've got the X and Y positions of where we think we want to put our food down, the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to say if game object is not equal to game manager dot find screen object, and I'm going to pass in the X and the Y. So basically what it's now saying is if we've returned false, then we're going to break out of this while loop. So basically it's saying that I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to continue finding a X and Y value where I have not put a piece of food. Now, this is something that I'm going to put in because when I get to it later on in the later stages of this, I'm going to actually create 3 or 4 food items, and I'm going to put a counter there. So when the food is spawned in, it then will start counting down a value from 10, 9, 8, 7. So when the snake eats that food, then whatever value the food is at that time is what your score is going to get added to. So if the snake eats the piece of fruit at, say, 3, the 3 will get added to the score. Okay, so now that we've got a position where we can spawn the food, let's go ahead and now spawn that in. So we're going to say game object, and let's call it go, just for abbreviation for game object. And we're going to instantiate the food prefab. And now I'm going to go new vector to, I'm going to say X comma Y. So that becomes the position to where we want the food to spawn. We're going to do a quaternion.identity, and we don't want that, so let's just remove that. So that just means that it will spawn at the, I mean, we don't have to do the identity, but it just means that the rotation is just going to be the same as what it should be. And because we have now added that, we need to go to the game manager, and we now need to go to the add screen object go.transform so that it now appears on the screen, in the list, so that when we do a search for it, we now know it's there. So if we've done the job properly, what will happen now is that we can now move the snake around, and every 3 seconds, so the snake will move, and then 3 seconds will go by, and then a piece of fruit will spawn, and then another 3 seconds will go, and then the snake will, not the snake, the piece of fruit will spawn. But for now, let's just do that, and let's go to the the editor. So if we now run this, we should see that this is what's happening. So, oops, we forgot one small detail. In the managers, I forgot to actually add the spawner. So let's create the spawner. And what we need to do is we need to say the piece of food is going to be in here. Now, what you could do is if you've got different pieces of fruit, you could have an array there and had all the different fruits there and do a random on the array to get which type of fruit you want. Now, the other thing is that I do also need to set up the border left, border right. Now, if we go back to the board, we can see that 37 is on the X there. So that basically means that it should be right on the edge there. So if we go to the managers, what we can do is we could say, well, okay, the border left is going to be minus 37. The border right should be 37, and the top should be 19, and the bottom should be minus 19. So if I've put these values in correctly, just clear that, that should spawn inside the walls. We've still got a null exception every 3 seconds. Why is that happening? So we double click on that, it should take us to, okay, so it hasn't picked up the game manager. So I know what that is. Okay, so the problem is in the way that I've created the enum. Now, normally I would do these as a singleton, but I thought I would do this a little bit sneakily and show you a way of doing it without creating singletons. And doing so, I need to actually create this. By default, I should have done this to begin with. I'm going to create, sorry, right mouse button on that. I'm going to go to quick actions and refactorings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it out to its own file. So I'm going to move it to a thing called gamestate.cs. And I'm now going to double click on that. Now, when it does this, it doesn't do it correctly because it should have just created it like that. So this has now become its own class of an enum. So we can go back to the food spawner and we're going to have a few errors. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix them by changing them to gamestate.inProgress, and we should be able to press play. Oops, we've still got a problem. So we missed one. What I forgot to do is in the managers here, I didn't add the actual game manager. Now, if we hit play, there we go. We've now seen the food is now spawning in different places in the editor. Now, provided that I've got the, I'm going to make the assumption that I've got the border left, border right, etc. set up correctly. If I haven't, we can adjust them later. But right now, we've now got food spawning. Okay, so the one thing that I haven't done is that when we create the snake head, we now need to add that to the screen objects as well. So we go back to the scripts and we go to where it spawns the snake in. So where we do the, it's actually in the board manager. So we need to do the same thing here. What we need to do is we need to do a private game manager, and we're going to call that underscore game manager. And in the awake, we're going to make sure that this is the very first thing we do. Game manager. I'm going to say find object of type game manager. So when we instantiate the snake's head, we're also going to go underscore game manager, and we're going to say add screen object and the go.transform. Actually, no, it's a snakehead.transform. That just means that now that the snake can also be seen from the food spawning. Okay, I did some testing off screen just to check the spawning of the food in the game area, and I discovered that it didn't actually work properly. So the values that I did find that worked fine was the border left of 36, border right of 23, and the border top and border bottom were still correct. And what I'd done was when I played the game, and I'll press pause very quickly. So basically it was this position -1. Oh, actually adding one, so it became 36. And it was this one, because the range is also inclusive of that last one, then it had to be that one. And this one was 19 as well. And I think they were actually all correct. Now, also while doing this, I found another problem. So if we go back to the script, and in the snake mover, we're doing a subscription on enable for the movement, but we forgot to actually do the unsubscribe. So I'll just copy the one that for the subscribe, and I'm just going to change that to a minus so that we now unsubscribe when the object gets disabled. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to add a countdown to the food. So what that means is that the food will self-destruct in X amount of time. The way we're going to do it is we're going to first open up our script. Not our script, our food, sorry, the prefab. So we did that by double clicking on our food prefab. Now I'm also going to create a text object to show that timer. So basically it'll be a 10-second timer, You can make this anything you want, but for now, I'm just going to go into here and create now, I don't know why, but for some reason, the text object is only in the 3D section. So even though we've got a 2D sprite, we need to go into the 3D object side, and we're going to go Text Mesh Pro from here. Now, this is not a UI text mesh, so we will import the essentials and then we'll close that down once that has been created. And what we'll do now is we're going to put a number here, and we'll just make that 9 for now. And what we'll also need to do is we're going to make the alignment on the center of both of them. And because it's not UI, we need to change the width and the height to 1. So that what that does is it brings it down to the size of the sprite. And we need to change the font size to 10. We could probably make it a little bit bigger, but 10 seems to be the sweet spot for this. Now, because we've changed the prefab directly, we don't actually need to save that because it will do it for us. But what we're also going to do while we're here is we will add a collider of type box collider, and we're going to select the 2D one. And I'm also going to change the size of this to about 0.98 on both the X and the Y. And while we're here, we'll also add the box, because we're going to need that for the snake. So we'll make 0.98 for the snake as well. And let me just take that over to here. Okay, so because the is actually just a tad smaller, what's going to happen is, well, it's probably not going to be that big a deal in this case, but when we do the walls and stuff like that, it will be a deal. But basically, when you've got two items close by, if they're touching, they're going to do a trigger. And the same as if you're using the physics, they're going to do a collision. So by reducing the collider just so slightly, we're just making sure that that is not going to trigger. So now that we've done that, let's now remove these from the scene. And I'm going to open the food back up again. And I'm going to go back into the scripts, and I'm going to create a script. And I think I'll call this food countdown. Name it anything you like. Food controller. I'm just going to call it countdown because that's exactly what it's going to do. So I can now open that up. And again, I'm going to remove the default stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just so that we've got a little bit of control, I'm going to do a serialized field, private int, because we want whole numbers. And we're going to say countdown timer, and we're going to default that to 9. Now that just means that we can make that 3 or 4 and make it as difficult as we want. But because of the size of the play area, 9 seems to be a sweet spot for this. Now, I'm also going to do another serialized field, and this one's going to be a text. Actually, this one's going to be text mesh one, and I sometimes forget how to do this one. But it's this one here. We want the Text Mesh Pro, and I'm going to call this one Countdown Text. And you'll see that it has automatically put in the using TM Pro, so that if your IDE doesn't automatically put this in, you'll know that you will need to put using TM Pro in here. I'm just going to get rid of those two because they're not needed. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do a start event, and we're going to do the same thing here. Oh, actually, we will need to do one more one because we're going to need to get a game object. So, the game manager. So we're going to do the same thing again, and this time I'm going to do this one in the awake. I could do it in the start, but I just like to keep this stuff in the awake. So I'm going to say game manager equals find object of type game manager, and in the start I'm going to say if underscore game manager dot current state is not equal to game state dot game in progress. That just basically is telling the system that if the game gets paused or game over, stop doing the countdown for us. So all we need to do there is do a return on that. We're going to now do a start coroutine, and we're going to put in here countdown. And if I can spell, I don't know why I did that. It's a call. I don't want food, I just want countdown. And of course it's complaining that I have not got it. So once again, I'm just going to click the light bulb and then generate the method. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't created it properly. So we probably should have just done it normally, but we need to create an enumerator and remove the throw. Now it is complaining because we do need to do a yield on this. But what we're going to do is we're going to basically say while the countdown timer, so countdown timer is greater than 0. Now, why is that not working there? Because I spelled while wrong. That'd be right. The first thing we're going to do is say yield return, and we're going to say new wait 4 seconds, and we're going to do 1 second. So that's basically going to say if the countdown timer is still above 0, let's wait a second. And then what we're going to do is decrement the countdown timer. And I've just noticed that I spelt the timer wrong. So let me go up here, and again, what we're going to do is we're going to hit the right mouse button, go on the rename, and this is going to make sure that it does all of the instances. And then I'm going to do that correctly and then hit enter. So that's now gone and changed all of them. So what we're going to do now is say if the game state, because what we want to do is we also want to make sure that if the game manager is not equal to the game in progress, then we exit the coroutine. So rather than type it in, I'm just going to grab this up here, and I'm going to paste that down here rather than retype it. And I'm going to say break so that it breaks out of the while loop. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say underscore game manager. So what this is going to do is we're going to say remove the screen object, and we're going to say transform. So we want the transform of the script that we've got. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say destroy and the game object. Okay, so that's what we've done. So if we go back to Unity, we need to make sure that the script is now attached to the food object. So what we can do is grab the food countdown and add it to the prefab by just dragging it and dropping it on there. And because we've now got a reference to the text object here, we need to grab the one we created up here and then just drag it into here. And because we've added all that to the prefab itself, we can just exit out of the prefab because it's already saved for us. So what will happen now is if we hit play, if we've done everything right, we should get food spawning on the screen, and it should have its own little countdown timer, which it's not counting down. It probably is counting down. So we've missed something, and I see what we've missed now that I think about it, because if I go back and let's wait for it to come up on screen. This is a good chance to go debugging. So if we pause the game and let's go to one of the objects. Click on the food clone itself. We can see that the timer has actually been counting down and it's at 4 now. So what that means is we haven't updated the actual text itself. Now there is 2 ways we can do that. We can do it through a property, but I'm not going to worry about that. Private void update. And the only thing what we're going to do here is we're going to say underscore countdown text dot text is going to equal our countdown timer itself, and we're going to convert that to a string and store it back into the text there. So if we now go back to Unity and we play it now, we should find that now working. And it's now working. and it'll keep spawning, and after it reaches to 0, it should destroy itself. And there you go, it's now destroying itself. So that's the food countdown done. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a trigger the snake head for eating the food and the wall. Now, the one thing that I forgot to do before is we'll go back to the food. And when I created these colliders, I forgot to make them triggers. So we're going to select the triggers on the snake head and the food. And we're also going to add a box collider to the tail and make that a trigger. And we're going to do the same thing for the wall. We're going to add a box collider and we're going to set that to a trigger. Now that we've done the triggers, what we need to do is now open up the snake script. So we will double click on the snake mover. What we're going to do is we're actually going to create another method in here, and this one's going to call onTriggerEnter 2D. And the onTriggerEnter, we're going to actually, before we go here, let me go back to the editor. Inside the editor, I'm going to go and create some tags, because if we look at the food and the snakehead, etc. prefabs, and in the inspector here, we can see that they're all labeled as untagged. So to create tags, we're going to click on this and go down to add tag. Now you can see that wall is actually already there. I may have added that without thinking. So we don't need to create the wall. So we're going to add a new tag and we call this snake. Oh, let's just call it head. And then we'll create another one, call that one tail, and that's going to be called wall. Sorry, that should have been food. So now if we go back to food, we can go back to the inspector by selecting the food prefab. We can now select food and make that food. We can go to the snake head and we can make that one head, and we can do the same for tail by making that tail, and we can do the same for wall and we can make that wall. Actually, I think with the tail, I might just call that snake as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the tag. So if I go back into the ads in the tag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the tail and I'm going to remove that. Let me add another one, and let's call that one snake, and I'll click make sure the head's still selected, and I'm going to remove that one. So we'll need to make sure that the snake is then set to snake for the head, and for the tail, we're going to select snake. There was no need to actually do two separate ones there. Actually, what happened there? I wonder if that's because it got all reordered. That's one thing I've noticed. Tags, if you do reorder them, you will have to redo them. So be very, very careful that you don't do that again. So anyway, I didn't think that we should have done two separate ones for the head and the tail. We should have just made it the one. So I'm going to go back to the script. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do a comparison. So what we're going to do is we're going to check for the collision, and we're going to do a compare tag. And the first one we're going to do is food. And what we're going to do is we're going to say food eaten. And we're going to say true. Actually, I might actually take that out and actually go food eaten. Yeah, I think I'll do that instead. And so that what we're going to do there is we're going to go and create, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to also pass in collision. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is do the same thing. I'm going to, as previous ones, I'm going to go generate method, and it's going to generate that for us. So what I want to do is say, okay, we are going to add a score. I'm not going to do the score just yet. I'll do that in a minute. But because we've eaten the food, we're going to do a destroy collision game object. And because we've done that, we're also going to underscore game manager. And again, we're going to do the remove the screen, and we're going to do the same thing, collision, this time game object dot transform. What we've done here is basically saying we have collided with something. Is that a food object? And if it is, then we're going to destroy it, and then we're going to remove it from our list of screen objects. So what that means is that because it's in that list of screen objects, if we remove it, then that means that that space can be reused if we randomly generate another one. So if we go back to the editor and we play the game, with a bit of luck, we've done everything right. I'm not going to get there. This one's going to be nice and close for us. And it didn't work. So what have we missed? So the first thing we need to do is check the snake head. We've got box collider is trigger. Oh, I know what we forgot. The most important thing. Okay, for colliders to work, we also need to make sure that we have a rigid body. And because this is a 2D, we need to add that as a rigid body 2D. Now I'm going to drag this up above the snake there, and I'm also going to do that to the collider as well, just to keep them in order so that all the Unity components are above and then the script. The other thing we need to do here is with the rigid body, we also want to turn the gravity scale to 0. Now, that just means that the gravity will not be applied in this case. I'm just going to save that just to make sure, and we'll play that again. With a bit of luck, we'll get one spawn right next to us. And there you go. We've now eaten the food. What we can do now is, if the game manager has the script, sorry, not the script, score. I don't know why I keep saying script. So if the game, because the game manager has the score, we can go back to the snake, and we can say here, we need to get the food countdown. We need to do a get component. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the collision. It's collision, not underscore. And we're going to say try get component food countdown. Actually, we're going to do that in a condition. Now that's complaining for some reason. Why is it complaining? See what we've done. We need to do out component. We'll just do that. Say food component. We need to give it a type, so we do food countdown, and we'll do it food component. So what that means is that if it does, if we do get that, we can then underscore game manager dot score plus equals food component dot. Actually, that's not going to work. What we need to do now is we need to go back to our food countdown, and because this is actually a private one, we're actually going to create a property for it. So to do that, what I'm going to do is right mouse button on this, go quick actions, and I'm going to go down here, and it's going to encapsulate and use a property, and that will then give us what we need. So what we've got now is the countdown timer. We've got a getter and a setter. So if we go back to our snake mover, and whoops, we forgot to save that. Go back to the snake mover. So that should now be fine. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to speed up the spawning just for the purposes. You can actually change this 3F. So I'm going to put it down to say 0.1. I'll actually make it 0.3. That's just going to make the food spawn a little bit faster. So it just gives you an idea on how to do that if you wanted to. What I should do is actually create variables up here that can be changed in the inspector. So if we now go back to the editor and press play, and while the board, is it the board? No, it's not the board. It's the managers, and we can see that the score is, let me bring the snake back in. If we keep an eye on the score in here, what that is should be doing is when we go over a snake, that should be increasing. So you can see if I now pause that the score has now increased. So that means that it was 6 when I ran over it. So that seems to be working correctly. So the one thing what we need to do now is to end the game when it's over. Oh, actually, the one thing I will do is I'm going to create a canvas UI, and we'll do that now. So I'm going to set this to scale with screen size, and I'm just going to put in 1920 by 1080, and we're just going to make sure that it's on match width or height, and that we're going to set that to 1. I'm now going to create a text under there, and this is going to be for the score. And if we double click on the canvas, we can see that it's centered it down here. So what I want is for it to be up in the top corner up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the score, the text score for it. And I'm going to select the rect transform here, and I'm going to tell it to go into the top corner. So I've not only first selected the corner, but I'm also going to change the pivot up there. So I'm also going to hold the Alt key, so set the position as well. And that's now up in the top corner. But I don't want it exactly in the top corner, because I also want to change the alignment to centered and middle. And I'm also going to change the size to, let's say 132. I change the width to say 250. Nope. 300, no, 350, and I'm just going to drag that over to somewhere about here, and just change that to a green color. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press play and pause. I pause and play. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to check to see if it's too big. It's a little bit too big and not exactly where I want it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unpause that, and I'm going to change that down to say 120, and I'm going to change that to say 90, and I'm just going to drag that over here a bit more. I'm not going to be too perfect about it, but just enough to make it look okay. Yep, that's fine. And I'm going to create another one. I won't bother about it, but actually I will bother about it. Is I should have actually created a empty game object in here, and I should have tagged that as, say, 400 by, I don't know, 300. What was the width of this again? 350. So we'll make that 350 by 300. Oops, not 3000. And this is going to go up in the top corner. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. And that time it's going to stay up there. Now, the reason I've done that is because what I'm going to do now is drag the text into here. And I'm also going to duplicate this. I'm going to just label that as score text. Score. And this one will be score text. So this one here, I'm going to put a vertical align layout group onto this, so that it is actually going to vertical lay out down here. Now, because I've got it up the top here, what I can do is just drag it down a little bit, so that, say, I don't know, about 250 maybe, or maybe 200. Yeah, 200 would be fine. So that basically what we can do now is by selecting on the score, I can now put in here 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Nah, 4 zeros will be fine. And I will drop this down to, say, 110. And I'm just going to make that a yellowish color, or maybe, actually, we'll make it white. And I might actually change this to yellow instead. There we go. So I'm just going to press play and just check that out. Yeah, that looks fine. Now, what we're going to do now is we're also going to create a script for the score. We just call this score. I might just call that score. And I'm going to open that up. Again, I'm going to remove this. And we're going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to do a serialized field. And this time I'm going to do this one as a text mesh pro UGUI, and this one's going to be score text, score, and I'm going to do awake. I'm going to do private game manager, and I'm going to do awake, and we just do the same thing as before. Game manager is equal to find object of type game manager. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create an update, and we're just going to say underscore score is equal to game underscore game manager dot score to string. We also need dot text here. So basically what that now means, if I go back to the editor, if we now start playing this and I start collecting food, so it didn't actually work. You know why it didn't work? Because I didn't add the script to the game object here. It doesn't really matter which game object you attach it to, as long as the score, where the score is going to be displayed, is added to there. So I could actually put it on the managers if I wanted to. So if we go back to playing the game, wait a few seconds, and there you go. So it's now updated the score. So the one thing that we could do is we could format it so that it's also got the zeros in there if we wanted to. But the one thing I will do is to make sure that the text for this one is aligned to the left-hand side of this. And I'm actually just going to drag this in a little bit so that it's just aligned. And you can do this any way you want, but I'm just going to do it this way for now. And that's now the score. So if we now play this, you can see that it's now aligned onto there, and I can go across and get that, and we can start creating our score. So what we're going to add now is the game over section. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another canvas, and I'm specifically going to be doing this one as a canvas because, and I'll just call this game over canvas. Part of the reason for using a second canvas is, if I spell that correctly, it's game over with an R. Okay, so the reason I have done another canvas is because it is more performant to disable a canvas than it is to disable a canvas element or a UI element in that canvas. I'm not going to go into huge detail about it. You can do this any way you want because this is only a very small game. Performance is not going to be an issue. So I'm going to actually create another text mesh in here. And this time I'm going to say game over is what we're going to call that. And I'm also going to put that as game over in the text. And I'm going to give that, I don't know, about 136. Do that 500. Nope. 800. Yeah, 800 by 200 should be fine. And I'm going to center that in there as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to default that to being disabled. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the game manager. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a serialized field, and we're going to call this private text mesh pro UGUI, and I'm going to call this game over. And once again, if you didn't notice, it's actually created the using TMP Pro up here for me. So if your editor does not do this automatically for you, you will need to add that. So what I'm going to do is inside the game over here, I'm actually going to do one or two things here. I'm going to do game over, and I'm going to say enabled equals true. What we could do is when we start playing the game, we could say game over dot enabled is equal to false. That means it will hide it when we start playing the game. So what we need to do lastly is go back to the snake, and we now need to do another trigger. So if we do, say, collision.compare tag, and this time we're going to say if we collide with the wall. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but the compare tags here are case sensitive. So whatever way you spell the tag, you need to make sure that you've put it in here as that as well. So in here, I'm going to say underscore game manager, and we're going to say set game state to game state dot game over. Now, provided that we've done everything correctly, when we play the game, we should find that the wall, if it's set to the trigger, which it is, so when we play the game, when the player hits the wall, we've got a null reference exception, so we'll fix that up first. And that would be because I forgot to put the game over into this section here. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this and drag that into there. Okay, so we'll play that again. Now, when the snake hits the wall, it should come up with game over and it should stop moving. Okay, it did stop moving, but I did the wrong thing. Instead of the canvas, I should have done the canvas in here and not the game object. So we can fix that by going back to the game manager. What we need to do is you need to change this to a game object, and we need to now change these to set, not serialized, set active, and this needs to be false. And I'm just going to copy that and paste that over this one. And then I'm going to make that true and go back into, now we need to fix that up. So we collect the actual canvas here for the game over, and we'll drag that into here. Why didn't that go over? There we go. Don't know why it didn't do it the first time. So if we now hit play, when the snake hits the wall, it should come up with game over, which it now has done. Now, it's centered into the center of the screen. We could fix that up, but I'm not going to bother. I'll let that happen for you guys to play around with it. But what I am going to do is to come back into the food countdown. Not the food countdown, the food spawner. And I'm going to change this back to 3. Pretty much the only thing we've got left to do is the tail itself, so that when we eat a piece of fruit, the tail will grow. And if we also hit our own tail, then we will also game over on that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to double check the snake, that the snake tail itself is 0.9. Yep, got a box collider, it's set to trigger. Yep. Now, the one thing I will do is I will change that to a white tail so that the head is a different color. So in the snake moving script, we're going to add a serialized field and private game object, and we're going to call this the tail prefab. And we're also going to add 2 more here. We're going to also create a list of transforms, and this list is going to hold the tails themselves. And one more was for a boolean, and that is going to say whether the food has been eaten or not. Now, originally I had decided to go down and create a method to do this, but on reflection, I think I will remove that and change it. So with the food being eaten, we also need to do a couple of things here. So I'm now going to switch this in to say food eaten is equal to true. And I'm going to pull these up to, actually, no, I'll leave them there. I originally had food eaten here and I took it out while I was doing a little bit of testing. So what I'll do is I will keep that there, but the difference now is what I'll do is I'll just change underscore food eaten to true here instead. So that should still work as expected. And it'll also mean that once the food has been eaten, it will actually, what I'll do is I'll actually remove it from the screen and then destroy it. I don't know how I hit the 1 key there, but anyway. Okay, now the other thing we need to finalize is that if we are going to collide with our tail, so we'll do a compare tag and, oops, wrong bracket. And we're just going to say snake. So that means if we hit the tail, we're also going to get a game over. Right. So the last thing we now need to do is we now need to grow the tail. As also, one other thing I need to remove too is in reflection. I'm going to remove this is moving because I don't think we actually need that. The last step we need to do is in the update. And once the food has begin to actually move, we're going to say if the food is eaten, then what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate the prefab for the tail. We're going to say game object, call it tail, is equal to instantiate underscore tail prefab. And we're going to say the previous position, and we're going to, why is that coming up? And quaternion identity. Okay, now what we need to do is add the tail to that list. So I'm going to, I'm going to say underscore tails dot insert. I'm going to insert that at the very beginning of the list. So when the list starts growing, it could be a size of 10, 5, 4, whatever. But we're going to make sure that it gets inserted at the very beginning. So we're just going to say go.transform because we want the, tail.transform because we want the transform in that list as what we've done there. What we also need to do is we now also need to make sure that we add that to the screen object as well. Oops, not tail.transform. And the one thing we now need to do is create an else if, and in this one here, what we're going to say is if the tails.count is greater than 0. Now, this particular one here is going to be the basis of the actual moving of the tail itself, but we're going to fake it. So what we're going to do is we're going to, when the last tail moves over, it's going to drop off the last one and we're going to remove it and then add it somewhere else. So to do that, we're going to say underscore tail dot last. Now, when we do this, it's not going to do that properly, but we're going to say dot position is equal to previous position. Now, I'm going to right mouse button over this because we can see that we have an error here, and right mouse button and then select the option there to create the link queue. So normally it would add that automatically, but I just showed you another way to actually add that. So once we've done that, what we now need to do is we need to do a tails.insert, and this is going to make sure that it gets the last position and it's going to go back to the first one. So we're going to say, 0, underscore tails, and if I spell it right, dot last. And that's just going to move when it comes to moving it, as I said before, it's going to take the last one, and instead of saying move it, I'm going to put it at the very beginning of the, actually I will remove it, but instead of moving it, I'm going to remove it, but I'm going to remove one of them, and I'm going to put the other one at the very beginning, and that's going to put that at the very beginning. And then I'm going to say tails dot remove at underscore tails dot count -1. So if we now play this, we forgot one small detail. On the snake head, we're going to scroll down to where the script is, and we're going to drag the tail prefab into here. That's one thing I did forget to do. So we'll press play again. And we see that we have forgotten something. So it's actually it's going to keep adding the tail, because what we forgot to do is that once we have eaten the food, we also need to say that the food eaten is now false. Going back to the editor, and we press play now, we should see, we can get some very close to us, that the snake will start growing. And that should be about it. There is one change I will make. So we'll just double check the tail has got a box collider, and it's definitely set to a trigger, and it's got 0.9. What we should have done here is we should have done an OR. The reason being is that if we did AND, that would mean that it'd have to have both of those conditions as being true. If we now come back to the editor and press play, we should now find that that is now working. So we're just going to get a few here. And there you go. So the one change that I did want to, well, actually there's two changes that we're going to make. I can actually see it there right now. And the one on the snake itself, I'm going to change the sorting order. Now, by default, they always on a default of 0, but I'm going to make the head 1. So what that means is that when the snake head collides with the tail, the head itself will always be on top of the tail. Now, the other change I want to make is if I go back to the script, and where we are incrementing the score, I'm actually going to put a +1 here. Now, the reason I'm going to do a +1 is because we can actually hit the food when it's 9, and we should be giving you 10 points if it's 9. And if it's 0 when you collide with it, you'll then get 1 point. So it'll always be 1 point higher than what is on the food itself. It's probably not something that I'm going to really worry about here, but if you really want to fix it, what you can do is, instead of putting 9 up there, you can put 10, or you can say, well, if it's greater than 9, then destroy it. Like if we go to the food countdown, for instance, we've got in here that if it's equal to 0, that means that it will not disappear until it goes into the negative figures. But if you don't want it to be 0, then you would just make that greater than 0 instead. Actually, one last thing, I am going to go back to the food spawner, and I'm just going to change this back to 0.3. Well, you have come to the end of this tutorial, and I hope that you did enjoy the content. I would also be delighted to see your progress after doing the tutorial. You can post your progress on the Discord server, and it would also be great if you could show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel.